long before the rise of empires and the sound of marching warriors, before temples reached for the sky or kings carved their names into stone, there was silence. In the highlands of what is now western Mexico, a land of deep lakes and gentle hills, life stirred slowly. It was here, among forests and fertile valleys, that the ancestors of the Tarascans, or Purépecha, began to shape a world of their own. The story begins not with kings, but with people. Thousands of years ago, before the name Purépecha was ever spoken, small groups of families settled near the shores of Lake Pátzcuaro. They fished, hunted, and gathered. In time, they learned to plant maize, beans, squash, the holy trinity of Mesoamerican sustenance. Their homes were simple, their tools of stone and wood, yet already their world was full of meaning. They sang to the fire, honored the rain, and told stories of the gods who lived in wind and mountain. By the first centuries of the first millennium, a more distinct culture had begun to form. Archaeologists call it Chupacuaro, named after a place where its remains were found. Though older than the Tarascan kingdom itself, Chupacuaro laid the first stones of a cultural road that would stretch far into the future. The people of Chupacuaro were skilled potters, crafting vessels in red, black, and cream. Their dead were buried with care, often surrounded by painted bowls and small figurines, signs of a belief in life beyond death. These early communities did not live in isolation. Trade routes crisscrossed the land like hidden rivers, linking them to faraway peoples, the Olmecs to the east, the peoples of the Pacific coast to the west. From them came new seeds, bright feathers, polished stones. And in return, the highland folk offered obsidian and quiet wisdom. Time passed. The centuries flowed like the waters of Lake Pátzcuaro. Settlements grew in number. Some became villages, others ceremonial centers. A shared way of life slowly took shape, not through conquest, but through common rituals, alliances, and the long memory of the land. Even then, there were whispers of a people unlike their neighbors. Their language, Purépecha, held no kinship to any around them. Their ways were distinct, their spirit already defined by independence. And yet, the rise of their civilization had not yet begun. The moment of unity, the spark that would kindle the Tarascan flame, was still to come. But the ground was ready. The mountains had watched and waited. The lakes had listened to prayers in the wind. And in the hearts of scattered clans, there stirred a longing, not just to survive, but to endure. Here, in the mists above the lakes, the ancient roots were set. From them would rise a kingdom unlike any in Mesoamerica. The hills of Michoacán had known many feet. Traders, hunters, and wandering tribes had crossed their slopes long before a single banner was raised. Yet in the 14th century, a new presence arrived, not in numbers, but in purpose. They were called the Huacusecha, meaning Eagle Clan. And they came not merely to live, but to lead. The tale of the Huacusecha is woven from memory and legend. According to tradition, they journeyed from the north, from a place called Ururumari, a name now lost to time. They were not conquerors in the usual sense, for they numbered few. But they carried something stronger than swords or shields, a vision. Among them was a man of commanding presence, Tarascan. Tarascan was not yet a king. He was a priest, a dreamer, a man who listened to the gods. It is said that Purépecha, the god of fire and war, came to him in a vision and revealed a destiny to unite the scattered peoples of the lakes under one rule. The gods, he believed, had chosen him not for glory, but for order. Not for plunder, but for permanence. He began in Pátzcuaro, a lakeside town where he found shelter and support. There, he married into local nobility, blending the blood of the Huaycusecha with the older lineages of the region. With patience and ritual, he forged alliances not by brute force, but by oath and shared flame. Soon, he turned to the neighboring settlements Ihuatzio and Tzintzuntzan. Tarascan's strategy was simple and profound. He did not seek to rule alone. Instead, he divided power among his kin. His son, Hikingaje, was given Ihuatzio. His nephew Tangixoan received Tzintzuntzan, and he himself remained in Pátzcuaro. Together, the three formed a sacred triangle, not of rivalry, but of shared rule. It was a rare and subtle wisdom, born not of ambition but of vision. Each city would guard one another, each leader tied by blood and vow. In this way, the foundation of the Tarascan state was laid, not by war, but by unity. Still, the lakes did not sleep easily. The region was home to many groups, each with its customs, gods, and grudges. Some resisted the rising star of the Huaycusecha. Skirmishes broke out. Temples were burned. Yet the alliance held. And with each challenge overcome, the idea of a greater people, the Purépecha, began to take shape. By the time Tarascan grew old, the lakes no longer belonged to many, but to one. The scattered stones had been gathered into a wall. The voices of three cities now spoke as one. And above them all, though he never crowned himself king, the shadow of Tarascan loomed, not as a tyrant, but as a father. He died, as all men do. But the dream he kindled lived on. From this point onward, the story of the Tarascan people would not be that of scattered clans, but of a nation in the making, born from the union of lake, blood, and fire. When Tarascan passed into the land of his ancestors, the lakes did not mourn in silence. Fires burned in 3 cities, drums echoed through the valleys, and priests raised smoke to the heavens. The founder was gone, but his design endured. His vision had not been for a solitary king, but for a brotherhood of rulers. In the heart of the Purépecha world, 3 cities rose like sacred pillars: Pátzcuaro, Ihuatzio, and Tzintzuntzan. Together they formed the bedrock of a new order, their names whispered in unison like a single breath. Pátzcuaro, the elder seat, held the memory of Tarascan. It was there that his bones were laid and his spirit remembered. It remained a place of pilgrimage, a city of priests and old houses, where tradition ran deep. Ihuatzio, to the east, took on the task of governance and judgment. Its nobles built courts and council houses, shaping the law of the land. And to the north, Tzintzuntzan, place of the hummingbirds, began to rise as the true center of power. It was Tangixoan, the nephew of Tarascan, who made Tzintzuntzan more than just a city. He strengthened its walls, built terraces that hugged the hill, and called artisans to carve stone and raise temples. Over time, its voice grew louder than the rest. Yet no one city claimed the crown, not yet. This tripartite rule was both fragile and brilliant. Each ruler, called a Reacher, held sway over their own domain but bound themselves by ritual and shared purpose. Together they coordinated war, divided tribute, and consulted the high priests in matters of omen and fate. Power was not hoarded, but distributed, and in this sharing, it endured. Outside the lakes, smaller communities watched and listened. Some pledged loyalty willingly, drawn by the promise of stability. Others required persuasion, and the armies of the Triad, though still young, proved capable. Victory brought new tribute: maize, cotton, feathers, obsidian. And with each success, the name Purépecha began to replace the older tribal identities. The unity was not perfect. Jealousies simmered, disputes flared, and old rivalries never vanished entirely. But the structure held, because it was bound not only by blood, but by belief. Each city lit its sacred fire to Kurikorai, god of war and warmth. Each ruler traced their right to govern back to Tarascan, and through him, to the will of the divine. So the Tarascan state began not as a single throne, but as a woven braid, 3 strands, strong together. In the years ahead, this braid would be tested. It would face enemies from without, and ambition from within. But for now, the lakes were calm. The fires burned steady. And the land listened to 3 voices, speaking as one. In the world of the Purépecha, the gods were not distant. They did not sleep in the sky or speak only to the high. They lived in the breath of the wind, the heat of the flame, the rhythm of the drum. To understand the Tarascan people is to understand the fabric of their faith, for it shaped not only their temples and rituals, but their very sense of time, power, and place. At the heart of it all stood Kurikorai, the god of fire and war. He was not a creator in the distant past, but a living presence, fed each day by sacred flame. Kurikorai's fire burned in every temple, but most fiercely in St. Sunsan, where his priests tended the eternal blaze atop the Yakata pyramids. He was the guardian of kings, the warmth in the cold night, the fury in battle. His power was both comfort and command. Yet Kurikorai did not reign alone. Alongside him stood Zaratanga, a goddess of the moon, water, and fertility. She balanced the fire with gentleness, the blade with birth. Her name was whispered by women in labor, by fishermen casting their nets, by priests who watched the sky for signs. Together, fire and water, war and nurture, shaped the dual essence of the world. The Purépecha saw the universe as ordered and layered. The earth was not a single realm but many, the sky above, the underworld below, and the surface where humans dwelled. Mountains were sacred, lakes were holy mirrors, and caves open to the deep places of the gods. To live well was to live in balance with these layers, to act in harmony with the unseen. Every village had its temple, every city its ceremonial heart. The temples were not vast like those of the Aztecs, but they were profound in meaning. The most distinctive were the Yakata, rounded pyramids set upon great platforms, curved like the hills themselves. They held not only idols but bones, offerings, and memory. Stone altars stood before them, stained with the blood of sacrifice. Yes, there was sacrifice, for life was believed to require it. The gods had given their blood to create the world, and so the people returned blood in kind. Captives taken in war, animals from the field, maize from the harvest, all were given back to the divine in gratitude and awe. Yet among the Purépecha, sacrifice was not as frequent nor as vast as among the Aztecs. It was solemn, not spectacular. Priests guided the people's steps. Clad in black, faces painted, they watched the stars, interpreted dreams, and kept the sacred calendar. Their wisdom was sought by kings, their rituals woven into every great decision. It was they who taught that time moved in cycles, that every rise would have its fall, and every fall its dawn. Through this web of belief, the Tarascan world took shape. Faith was not an ornament but a skeleton, holding up the body of society. The Irecha ruled not merely by force or lineage, but by divine sanction. The people obeyed not only because they must, but because the gods watched. And so the Purépecha lived their days beneath the eyes of the sacred, warmed by the fire of Curacorai, bathed in the light of Zaratanga's moon. Their world was not one of chance, but of purpose. Not of chaos, but of order. The gods had given them the land, and in return they gave the gods their trust, their labor, their lives. Beneath the sacred fires and rising temples of the Purépecha world, the people bent their backs to the soil. For all the prayers to Curacorai and the songs for Zaratanga, life was sustained not only by the gods, but by grain, salt, and sweat. The Tarascan economy, quiet, enduring, and intricately woven, was the true breath of the kingdom. The land around the lakes of Pátzcuaro, Quetzio, and Zirahuan was kind to those who knew it well. The volcanic soil was rich, the rains generous, and the highlands gentle in slope. Here, generations of farmers had long coaxed life from the earth. The triad of Mesoamerican sustenance, maize, beans, and squash, grew in careful rows, their roots nourishing one another in mutual support. Fields were often small, passed down within families, though larger communal lands were worked under the oversight of nobles or temples. Terraces carved into the hills preserved the rain and shielded the soil. Men and women rose with the sun, guided by the calendar's rhythm, planting in season, harvesting with ceremony. Each cycle was not merely a task, but a sacred return. Beyond maize, the Purépecha cultivated chili peppers, tomatoes, amaranth, and cotton. Along the lakes, they fished with nets and traps, catching whitefish and frogs, the latter considered a delicacy. On higher slopes, they raised turkeys, dogs, and even bees. The forests gave wood, the hills gave stone, and deep within the earth, a secret wealth, metal. This metal, copper, silver, and gold, would one day shape their power. But even in these earlier days, the Purépecha were already skilled metallurgists, hammering and casting tools, bells, and ornaments. They were nearly alone in Mesoamerica in this craft, and their handiwork would soon be sought across valleys and mountains. Markets were the veins of the economy. In towns and cities, open plazas bustled with barter and murmur. Salt, woven cloth, obsidian blades, goods, pottery, all passed from hand to hand. There was no coinage, but value was known, and exchange flowed like a dance. Long-distance merchants, called Pochteca among the Aztecs, found their equivalents here, though they were fewer and less exalted. Some goods came from afar. From the Pacific coast came shells, dried fish, and colored feathers. From the hot lands to the south, cacao and tropical fruits. In return, the highlands offered metal tools, fine pottery, and crafted goods. The Tarascan realm, though not as sprawling as that of the Mexica, was tightly knit and resourceful. Labor, too, was a currency. Great public works, roads, temples, terraces, were built through corvée labor, owed by commoners to their local lords. This service, though demanding, was deeply tied to identity. To build for the gods or the ruler was to build for the people, a visible proof of belonging and loyalty. And over it all stood a system of tribute, a carefully measured offering from town to temple, from field to throne. Nobles collected, scribes recorded, and storehouses filled. This tribute did not crush the people, for it was calibrated and ritualized. But it ensured that power remained fed, and that the Erecha could govern not only with might, but with abundance. Thus, the economy of the Tarascans pulsed not with gold or conquest, but with rhythm and reciprocity. Every harvest was an offering. Every market, a gathering of fates. The kingdom endured not just through war, but through the steady, humble miracle of food, craft, and fire. By the time the three cities stood in harmony and the fields yielded steady grain, the Purépecha kingdom had become more than a gathering of clans. It was a rising force, aware of its strength and tested by its neighbors. The hills no longer only echoed with the sound of prayer or harvest. Now, the drum of war joined the chorus. To defend what had been built, the Tarascans formed a disciplined and purposeful military structure, unlike that of their eastern rivals. Warfare was not for glory or for the capture of thousands, but for protection and submission. The Purépecha did not seek to expand endlessly, but rather to ensure the security of their highland core and the steady flow of tribute from surrounding lands. Their warriors were organized under the guidance of the Erecha, who held not only political but sacred command. Beneath him stood generals and captains, many drawn from noble houses. Each warrior bore arms not simply as a duty, but as a spiritual role, for to protect the lakes was to guard the sacred order itself. Weapons were crafted with skill, obsidian-tipped spears, atlatls, clubs, and wooden shields lined with hide. But unlike many others in Mesoamerica, the Purépecha possessed a rare advantage: metal weaponry. Small copper axes and knives, more durable than obsidian, gave them a quiet edge in battle, and hinted at the deeper metallurgical expertise that would define their strength in the years to come. Their wars were strategic. Rather than plunging into endless conquest, the Tarascans secured key valleys and trade routes, bringing towns into the fold through show of force or diplomacy. Tribute was often demanded, but with clear terms. In exchange for submission, communities received protection, access to markets, and recognition of local rulers under the Greater Purépecha order. This tributary network grew steadily. Towns paid in maize, cloth, feathers, obsidian, fish, or copper, each contribution carefully recorded by scribes who used a mix of pictorial and symbolic systems. Tribute was not simply wealth, it was proof of loyalty, of being part of something larger than one's village or clan. Occasionally, rebellion flared. A noble might resist, or a community refuse tribute. Then, the Erecha's response was swift. Troops would be dispatched, temples watched, and the sacred fire invoked. Victory brought reaffirmation, not only of political power, but of cosmic balance. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine the Purépecha as a people of conquest. Their wars were measured, necessary, never ritualized spectacles like those of the Aztecs. They fought to maintain their world, not to reshape others. They sought stability, not domination. This approach created something rare in the highlands, a realm that was firm yet flexible, powerful yet not overreaching. It was a spider's web of loyalties, woven from blood, trade, and belief. And at its center stood the lakes, watched by warriors, guarded by gods, sustained by the quiet force of tribute. In the growing strength of their arms and the reach of their order, the Purépecha did not yet see themselves as empire. But step by step, field by field, submission by oath, they were becoming one. A people of stone and flame, bound by purpose, guardians of a world slowly taking form. Before the sword was raised or tribute demanded, a people first speaks, to each other, to their gods, and to the land they call home. Among the Purépecha, their voice was as distinct as their path through history. Their language, unlike any other in Mesoamerica, was a mystery and a marker, a tongue with no known relatives, a sound that stood alone. Scholars would one day puzzle over it, noting how the Purépecha language bore no kinship to the Nahuatl of the Aztecs, nor to the Mixtec or Maya tongues to the south and east. It was isolate, a linguistic island surrounded by seas of different voices. But for the people themselves, it was not strange. It was home, the sound of lullabies and commands, of market haggling and sacred chants. They called themselves Purépecha, meaning the common people, or sometimes simply the people. It was a term of unity, not of pride, a name that bound fisherman and farmer, noble and scribe. To speak the tongue was to belong, no matter one's village or trade. From this language flowed a rich tradition of oral expression. Though they did not write in the same way as the Maya with their glyphs, or the Aztecs with their codices, the Purépecha preserved memory through speech and image. Stories passed from elder to child, priests taught through chants, and history was kept alive in carved symbols, painted murals, and ritual performance. Their art reflected the same spirit, distinct, rooted, and full of quiet meaning. Pottery was painted in bold, earthy colors, reds, browns, ochres. Designs were not mere decoration, but carried symbolic weight, spirals for water, crosses for the four directions, animals for the spirits that walked beside humans. Stone carvings were rare but powerful. In temple sites like Tzintzuntzan and Ihuatzio, one finds yacata platforms, not covered with intricate reliefs, but shaped with sacred geometry. Their form, rounded, stepped, curved like the wings of birds or the contours of the lake hills, spoke a visual language, aligning the earthly with the cosmic. Music, too, played its part. Flutes of clay, drums of skin, and rattles made of seeds, these instruments echoed in both festival and funeral. Dancers painted their bodies, wore feathered headdresses, and moved in patterns that mirrored the seasons. Each gesture was layered with meaning, each rhythm tied to myth. In public festivals, one could see the full expression of Purépecha identity. Songs honored the ancestors, prayers called down blessings, and the people gathered not to be entertained, but to remember who they were, where they came from, and what held them together. This cultural life, grounded in language, symbol, and craft, gave the Tarascan realm a resilience that swords could not. Even when borders shifted or rulers died, the people remained themselves. The god still heard prayers in Purépecha. The pot still bore ancestral signs. The land still answered to names that no outsider could pronounce. So it was that the soul of the Tarascan people was not found only in palaces or temples, but in the humble and the handmaid, in a song carried on lake wind, in a pot shaped by a mother's hand, in the words spoken beside the fire. This was their voice, alone among the peoples of the world, but strong, clear, and enduring. A voice not yet silenced. In the twilight of his years, Tarascan watched the fires rise over the lakes, not with pride, but with purpose. He had laid the foundation, the alliance of cities, the faith in Purépecha, the rhythm of tribute and harvest. But he knew, as all wise rulers do, that what is built with words must be guarded with blood. And so, before death claimed him, he gathered his kin for a final act, not of conquest, but of careful division. He called forth his son Hikingaje, his nephews Tangaksoan and Hyapan, and others of his noble house. In solemn ritual, before the temple flame, he divided the land not to weaken it, but to protect it. Each would rule a domain, Pátzcuaro, Ihuatzio, and Tzintzuntzan, not as rivals, but as stewards of a shared legacy. To each he gave a sacred duty, a portion of the priesthood's trust, and a share of the warrior bands. They were not kings, but guardians, tied by blood, oath, and the divine will of Purépecha. It was a structure unlike others, a brotherhood of rulers, not a single monarch. In this, Tarascan hoped to preserve balance, for he had seen how envy and hunger for power could undo even the strongest thrones. When he died, his body was laid to rest in Pátzcuaro. His spirit, it was said, rose with the smoke and settled in the fire, to watch over the realm he had shaped. The land did not weep loudly. There were no wailing multitudes, no sudden collapse. For his design had held, and would hold. Yet time, like water, wears even the strongest stone. Though the triad of cities continued to honor Tarascan's pact, the world around them began to change. The Purépecha heartland grew stronger, fields more fertile, armies more disciplined, tribute more plentiful. The people multiplied, and with them, their needs and ambitions. Younger nobles, born after the founder's death, began to question, why must rule be shared? Why must power halt at the edge of a lake, when valleys beyond waited like open hands? The vision of unity remained, but the pulse of empire had begun to stir. Within the cities, the balance slowly shifted. Tzintzuntzan, perched on the northern edge of the lake, grew faster than its siblings. Its roads were better kept, its warriors more numerous. Trade passed increasingly through its gates. And though it did not yet claim supremacy, the other cities began to lean toward it, not from fear, but from necessity. The descendants of Tarascan, meanwhile, married into other noble houses, weaving a web of alliances that stretched beyond the lakes. The Purépecha state was no longer merely an alliance of cities, it was becoming a kingdom, even if the name had not yet been spoken. Still, the system of divided rule endured. It would remain for a time, a testament to the founders' foresight. But like all human structures, it would one day yield to the force of growth, of ambition, of history's deeper currents. For now, the lakes were quiet. The fire still burned. And the memory of Tarascan lingered not only in temples, but in the shape of a people who stood together, because one man had dreamed, and then let go. As the generations passed beyond the age of Tarascan, the pulse of the Tarascan world began to draw inward, toward a single center. Though the three cities, Pátzcuaro, Ihuatzio, and Tzintzuntzan, had once shared power in harmony, it was the northernmost of them, perched above the lake like a hawk over the reeds, that began to shine with a new light. Tzintzuntzan, the place of hummingbirds, was becoming more than a city. It was becoming a capital. At first, the change was gentle, almost invisible. A few more merchants settled near its plazas. A few more warriors trained in its fields. The nobility, once evenly scattered, began building their homes and halls in Tzintzuntzan's growing shadow. The city, which once shared in the flame of Curacori, now bore its brightest altar. The sacred fire blazed highest here, drawing priests and pilgrims alike. The reasons were many. Geography played its hand. Tzintzuntzan stood on a long ridge above the lake, with natural defenses and a commanding view of the waters and valleys below. It was close enough to Pátzcuaro and Ihuatzio to remain linked, yet far enough to grow without constraint. Its terraces rose like giant steps into the sky, and at their crest stood something unlike anything in Mesoamerica, the Yucatan pyramids. These rounded structures, curved and massive, set upon broad stone platforms, were both temples and symbols. Built without mortar, fitted with care, they housed the ashes of rulers, the offerings of priests, and the memory of the people. They did not reach to the sky like Aztec pyramids. Instead, they embraced the land, curved like wings or hills, echoing the very soul of the Purépecha. Around these sacred structures, the city unfurled. Roads of stone led to workshops, homes, council halls. Artisans crafted copper bells, clay vessels, and woven cloth. Farmers brought maize and chilies to market. Warriors sharpened obsidian blades in the courtyards of their barracks. And in the palaces, the Iricha, now ruler in more than name, held court. For though the idea of shared rule still lived in speech and ceremony, power had consolidated. Tzintzuntzan had become the seat of the dynasty. The heirs of Tarascan no longer merely governed their share, they commanded the realm. Tribute flowed to them, armies answered their banners, and emissaries carried their will to distant towns. The city itself became the heart of administration. Scribes recorded tribute and census, priests calculated omens, and messengers set out with orders sealed by ash and feather. The highlands around the lakes, once scattered and loosely bound, now beat to a single rhythm, one set in the capital above the lake. Yet Tsinsunsun did not rule by fear. It ruled by structure, by ritual, by presence. Its streets were orderly, its rituals constant, its voice steady. It promised protection, prosperity, and connection to the divine order. And for now, that promise held. The hummingbirds that once gave the city its name, swift, precise, and radiant, seemed now to echo the city's spirit. For Tsinsunsun moved with quiet force, expanding not only its reach, but its meaning. What had begun as one of three now stood as one above all, not through conquest alone, but through gravity, through design, and through the subtle weight of time. The capital had risen, and with it, the empire it would soon command. As Tsinsunsun rose above the lakes in stone and flame, so too did the unseen structure beneath it, the web of governance, delicate yet strong, which held the Tarascan realm together. This was not an empire of chance. It was administered, observed, recorded, and, above all, believed in. At its center stood the Irecha, the supreme ruler, more than a king, yet not a god. He was the living channel between the people and Kurikorai, keeper of the sacred fire, commander of armies, and judge of last resort. His word carried the weight of both throne and temple, and yet his authority was not unchecked. Around him stood a careful array of advisors, nobles, priests, and officials, each playing their part in the machinery of state. The Irecha was chosen not simply by blood, but by counsel. Upon the death of a ruler, the noble houses gathered, guided by high priests, to select the next. Lineage mattered, but so did character, omen, and support. In this way, the throne passed not always from father to son, but to the most fitting among the royal kin, a practice both practical and deeply ceremonial. Beneath the Irecha, power was distributed among a hierarchy of officials. At the top were the noble governors, often royal relatives, who ruled over major provinces and tributary towns. These were not puppet lords but responsible stewards, tasked with collecting tribute, maintaining order, and upholding sacred rites. They reported directly to the capital and were often summoned for council and ceremony. Further down the chain were local leaders, many of whom had once ruled their towns independently. Under Tarascan rule, they retained limited autonomy, so long as they fulfilled their tribute and remained loyal. This policy of indirect rule allowed for smoother governance, fewer rebellions, and a sense of local identity within the larger whole. The bureaucracy was extensive and layered. Scribes, known as kalpiksk, recorded tribute, land use, census data, and legal matters using symbolic and pictorial systems. Though the Purépecha lacked a full writing system like the Maya, they developed a complex means of record-keeping, painted codices, carved markers, and oral mnemonics maintained by trained functionaries. Justice, too, was a cornerstone. Laws were enforced through local courts, overseen by appointed judges. Crimes ranged from theft and land disputes to sacrilege and treason. Punishments were swift, often severe, but not indiscriminate. The goal was not terror, but order, the preservation of balance, both social and spiritual. At the heart of this system was a belief that harmony between people, land, and gods was essential. The government did not exist merely to tax or command, but to sustain that harmony. The Ericha, by acting with justice and devotion, maintained the divine equilibrium, a balance that, if lost, could bring not only political collapse, but cosmic disorder. And so the machinery of rule turned, quietly, steadily. From the markets of the smallest village to the yukata platforms of Tsintsantsan, the rhythm of government was felt in every field, every prayer, every tribute collected. The Tarascan state was not a loose confederation, nor a tyranny. It was a woven order, firm yet flexible, rooted in belief and sealed in custom. In this structure, the Tarascan realm found its endurance. In this shape of power, it prepared itself for challenges yet unseen, and storms yet to come. The Ericha sat not merely upon a throne of wood or stone, but upon a seat sanctified by fire. In the Tarascan world, kingship was not a worldly ambition. It was a divine burden, one born with solemnity, ritual, and constant remembrance that power, once granted by the gods, could be withdrawn just as swiftly. From the moment he was chosen, the Ericha was no longer fully mortal. He became a living vessel of Kurikorai, the god of fire and war, and through him, the people were connected to the heavens. His authority came not by conquest or wealth alone, but by the sacred flame, the eternal fire that burned atop the temples of Tsintsantsan, never allowed to die. The investiture of a new Ericha was one of the most sacred ceremonies in the kingdom. It began with omens, stars read, dreams interpreted, signs in the behavior of animals or winds observed. Once the council of nobles and priests confirmed their choice, the ceremony unfolded over many days. The chosen ruler would fast, pray, and be bathed in sacred water. He would walk barefoot to the temples, accompanied by chants and dancers, and there he would make offerings to Kurikorai, sometimes including blood sacrifice, to bind himself to the god in body and spirit. Only then would he be seated upon the ceremonial stool, the wapiti, carved from sacred wood and set upon a raised platform. The fire would be kindled beside him, and from that moment, he would govern not only as man, but as the earthly hand of the divine. His daily life was filled with ritual. He greeted the fire at dawn, received tribute before mid-morning, presided over court in the afternoon, and offered prayers at dusk. Festivals and sacred cycles governed his calendar, and each movement was watched, not by guards alone, but by priests who ensured his behavior upheld the sacred balance. To rule poorly was to offend the gods. And yet, this power was not solitary. The Ericha was bound by sacred law and cosmic duty. He could not act in haste, nor rule by whim. He relied on his council, a body of nobles and priests, to deliberate on war, justice, and diplomacy. His word was final, but only after ritual consultation. For to lead unwisely was not only a political error, but a cosmic threat. The king was also a guardian of continuity. He spoke the names of ancestors during ritual, preserved the memory of past Ericha, and maintained their tombs and shrines. It was believed that the strength of the realm rested not only in the living, but in the honored dead. Each king became part of an unbroken chain, a lineage not of blood alone, but of spirit. Symbols of his office were few but potent: a copper axe, sign of judgment and command, a feathered mantle, representing connection to the sky, and the sacred stool, never sat upon by others. He was served by attendants but was never to appear in idle leisure. The Erecha was always watched, always weighed, and always responsible. Thus, kingship among the Purépecha was neither tyranny nor ornament. It was a sacred stewardship, a flame held in the hand, dangerous yet vital. And as long as the Erecha honored the gods, served his people, and upheld the cosmic balance, the realm would endure. But if the fire faltered, if the sacred order was broken, then even kings could fall. For in the Tarascan heart, the throne was fire, and fire both warms and consumes. In the Tarascan world, wealth did not shimmer in coins or sleep in vaults. It moved through hands, across valleys, over lakes, flowing like breath through the body of the kingdom. Tribute was not only a measure of submission, but the very lifeblood of the state, a sacred exchange that bound the people to the Erecha and the Erecha to the gods. The tribute system was vast, precise, and deeply ritualized. Each town, each village, knew what was expected. There were no coins, value was calculated in goods and labor, a practical and spiritual economy that mirrored the cycles of the earth and the rhythms of society. Maize, the mother of sustenance, was the most common offering. It filled granaries in Tzintzuntzan and fed both palace and priesthood. Cotton cloth, finely woven and dyed in soft reds and deep blues, came from the warmer valleys. Fish, frogs, and lake salt arrived from the shores. From the hills came obsidian blades, deer hides, and feathers of every hue. And always, there was metal, copper bells, knives, and ingots, forged with skill unique to the Purépecha. These offerings were not hoarded but redistributed, to feed soldiers, reward nobles, sustain temples, and store for times of famine. The Erecha was not a collector of wealth, but a keeper of balance. His power rested not in riches, but in the smooth functioning of the system. Oversight was entrusted to tribute officials, drawn from trusted lineages. They recorded what was owed and what was received, using painted codices and memory devices, strings of knotted cords, clay tokens, and marked hides. Tribute was gathered not haphazardly, but on a set calendar, tied to the agricultural cycle and sacred festivals. In times of drought or war, tribute might be eased or replaced with labor. Roads needed mending, temples expanding, canals dug. Every community was part of this shared effort. To give was not a punishment, but a sign of inclusion, of standing in the greater body of the realm. Rebellion, of course, disrupted this flow. When a town refused to pay or sent goods of poor quality, the Erecha's emissaries would first issue warnings, then demands, and only lastly, war. For the system was not only economic but moral. Tribute was a form of loyalty, and its breach a spiritual disorder. At the capital, storehouses stood wide and ordered. Here, the state kept its pulse, grain for the army, cotton for official robes, copper for ritual gifts. From these warehouses, the realm was fed and armed, not lavishly, but sufficiently. The Purépecha did not seek opulence. They sought stability. Trade also fed the system, though it remained secondary to tribute. Merchants, both local and distant, brought in goods from the coast, the southern jungles, and even from Aztec lands. Shells, cacao, tropical fruits, and fine feathers entered Purépecha markets, sometimes through barter, sometimes as part of negotiated tribute. But always, the core of wealth remained the people, their work, their offerings, their participation in a cycle older than any throne. For the Tarascan economy was never about gold or glory. It was about order, the sacred flow between earth and temple, ruler and village, God and man. As long as that flow remained unbroken, the kingdom stood strong. And in the silence of storehouses and the bustle of markets, the real strength of the Purépecha could be heard, steady, quiet, and enduring. In the highlands of the Purépecha, beauty did not serve vanity. It served memory, reverence, and presence. Art was never merely seen, it was experienced, touched, danced, and invoked. It was a language through which the divine was made visible, and through which the people remembered who they were. The Purépecha did not build towering pyramids covered in reliefs like their eastern neighbors, but their art held its own quiet power. Their forms were curved, subtle, symbolic, mirroring the hills and lakes that cradled their world. Temples were shaped with care, especially the yukata, whose rounded contours echoed the flow of wind and water, a sacred geometry of the land itself. Within these temples, and within homes and plazas, lived the sacred images, the representations of gods, ancestors, and mythic beings. These were not statues to be admired, but vessels to be honored. They were bathed, clothed, and fed. Priests spoke to them as living presences, for in them dwelled fragments of the divine. Most sacred was Purépecha, god of fire and war. His image was kept in the highest temple at St. Sunson, surrounded by attendants and offerings. He was not portrayed with human likeness, but as a bundle of sacred sticks and feathers, tied with care, his power too great for a human form. Around him danced the flames, and from him flowed the order of kings. Alongside him, other deities were honored. Zaratanga, goddess of the moon and lakes, was often symbolized by curved patterns, watery lines, and feminine forms. Tirapim, ancestral spirits and divine intermediaries, were remembered in household shrines and burial offerings. Their images were carved in clay, painted on walls, whispered in prayer. Ceremony was the breathing rhythm of the Tarascan people. Each season brought its festivals, not of spectacle, but of alignment. Crops were blessed with song and smoke. The sun's path marked days of fasting and joy. Drums echoed through the valleys as dancers, painted in red and black, moved in patterns older than memory. Every step was a word. Every motion, a prayer. Feathers adorned the dancers' heads, blue for sky, green for life, red for sacrifice. Their cloaks were woven with symbols of water and wind, of maize and stars. Music rose from clay flutes, turtle-shell drums, and rattles filled with seeds. The people gathered not to watch, but to participate, to feel the turning of the world through movement and sound. Pottery and textiles also bore the sacred touch. Vessels were not simply containers, but storytellers, painted with spirals, jaguars, birds, and eyes. Each pattern had meaning, each color a voice. Blankets and garments, woven by women in patterns handed down for generations, carried the memory of ancestors in every thread. Even death was honored with beauty. The dead were buried with care, wrapped in woven cloth, surrounded by pots of food and carved figurines. Their spirits, it was believed, continued on, and through these offerings, they remained part of the living world. Thus, art in the Tarascan realm was not ornament, but bridge between people and gods, past and present, earth and sky. It was a sacred language, spoken in color and clay, in feather and fire. And in its quiet persistence, it preserved the soul of a civilization. In the hands of potters, dancers, and priests, the face of the divine was made known, not in grandeur, but in presence. Not in noise, but in form. This was the sacred image, ever-changing, ever-returning. In the Purépecha world, every person had a place, not imposed by tyranny, but woven through birth, duty, and tradition. The kingdom was not built of stone alone, but of relationships, carefully balanced, where power flowed downward and responsibility upward, in a delicate web that held the realm together. At the summit stood the Purépecha, the sacred ruler, surrounded by his family and court. Beneath him stretched a noble class known as the Purépecha, the lords and lineage heads who administered towns, led armies, and upheld the rights of the ancestors. These nobles did not simply inherit wealth, they inherited obligation. They were stewards, commanders, and the visible face of royal will in distant places. Each noble house traced its origin to divine favor or ancestral glory. Some claimed descent from Tarascan's own line, others from warriors who had defended the lakes or priests who had once spoken to the gods. Their homes were larger, their clothes richer, adorned with cotton, copper, and feathers. Yet their status was not immune to judgment. Nobility could rise through valor and fall through dishonor. Below them lived the commoners, the Purépecha, who gave the kingdom its name. They farmed the fields, fished the lakes, and filled the markets. They served in armies, built roads, and wove cloth. Most lived in small homes of cane and mud, roofed with thatch, gathered in villages that dotted the highlands like stars. Their lives were not free of burden, but they were not without dignity. To serve one's lord was not shameful, it was participation in the sacred order. Yet even among the commoners, there was structure. Artisans, merchants, farmers, and fishermen each had roles, each respected for their craft. Smiths, especially those who worked copper, were held in quiet awe for they shaped metal, and metal was a thing of both beauty and war. Weavers carried the memory of their mothers' patterns. Potters passed down stories in clay. At the edges of this society stood those of uncertain status, war captives, criminals, and those who had fallen from favor. Some were enslaved, but not in chains. They worked in temples, noble houses, or farms, often with the chance of redemption through loyal service or the birth of children into free life. The Tarascan world was rigid, but not sealed. Movement was rare, but possible. Women held a place of respect, though distinct. They rarely held political office, yet were essential in domestic, ritual, and economic life. Mothers taught language and tradition. Wives managed households, weaving cloth that bore both family pride and religious meaning. Some women served as priestesses or midwives, guardians of life's sacred thresholds. Children learned by doing. Boys joined their fathers in fields or at arms, girls learned to spin, cook, and sing the old songs. Education was practical, oral, communal. Elders were revered, not because of law, but because memory was power, and they carried it. Above all, society was interdependent. The Erecha ruled, but he ate from the farmer's field. The noble commanded, but wore the weaver's cloth. The priest gave blessings, but walked on roads built by the hands of many. No class existed in isolation. All were part of the greater whole. This was not a world of perfect justice. There was hardship, inequality, and fear. But within the Tarascan order, there was also meaning, a belief that each person, by fulfilling their role, upheld the harmony of the cosmos. And so society stood, not as a ladder to be climbed, but as a fabric to be maintained. A garment of many threads, worn by a people who believed that peace, like fire, required tending. Though the Purépecha heartland beat strongest around the lakes of Pátzcuaro, Quitsio, and Zirahuan, the kingdom's body stretched far beyond. It was not a nation of a single people, but a woven realm, binding together many tongues, customs, and lineages under the watchful gaze of the Erecha and the eternal fire. At the center stood the Purépecha themselves, the speakers of an ancient, isolate language, keepers of the sacred fire, and descendants of Tarascan's house. Their identity shaped the kingdom's rituals, its hierarchy, its deepest myths. But surrounding them were countless others, drawn into the realm through conquest, alliance, or necessity. These outer peoples, the Chichimeca, Otomi, Matlatzinca, and others, lived in the valleys, forests, and borderlands. Some spoke Nahuatl, others dialects now lost to time. They farmed, hunted, and worshipped in ways both familiar and strange. And yet, under Tarascan rule, they became part of the whole. The Purépecha approach to governance did not erase difference. Instead, it absorbed and adapted. Conquered towns were often left under local rule, so long as tribute was paid and the Erecha acknowledged. Temples to local gods were respected, and in some cases, incorporated into broader ritual calendars. The state's aim was coherence, not uniformity. Over time, a shared identity began to form, not by law, but by participation. To serve in the army, to appear at market, to bring offerings to Tsintsuntzan, these acts slowly wove together the realm's many parts. The Purépecha language spread as an administrative tongue, used in court and tribute records. Yet local languages survived, heard in homes and fields. This system brought strength. It gave the Tarascan state a resilience, allowing diverse peoples to live under one banner without constant revolt. But it also brought tension. Border towns, especially those near Aztec lands, lived under pressure, both from within and without. Some feared cultural loss, others longed for fuller inclusion. Identity became layered. A man might be Otomi by birth, Purépecha by duty, a subject of the Erecha, and a worshipper of his village god. These layers were not contradictions, they were the fabric of life in a living kingdom. In certain regions, cultural blending took root. Pottery styles shifted. Names changed. Intermarriage spread. The empire became a mosaic, its pieces distinct but fitted together with care. In the great festivals of Tzintzuntzan, one could hear a dozen accents. In the tribute caravans, goods carried the touch of many hands. The Erecha's scribes kept careful records of which towns owed what: the maize, copper, warriors, cloth. These were not just economic tools, but maps of identity. They marked who belonged, and how. And they revealed the quiet truth that the kingdom was not one people, but many, walking together. Yet this unity required tending. When the balance tipped, when tribute became too heavy, or respect too thin, the outer threads frayed. A wise ruler knew this and governed with measured firmness. For an empire of many must be governed by inclusion, not imposition. And so the Tarascan state stood, not a monolith, but a tapestry. Boundaries were real, but permeable. Identity was fixed, yet flexible. It was not purity that gave the realm its strength, but diversity, managed with care, honored in form, and held together by shared flame. The Tarascan state, born of lakes and tempered by fire, did not remain still. As strength gathered in Tzintzuntzan and tribute flowed steadily inward, the realm looked outward, not with reckless ambition, but with strategic purpose. Expansion was not a hunger, but a necessity to secure borders, control trade, and hold rivals at bay. Unlike the Aztecs, who swept through Mesoamerica in waves of conquest and sacrifice, the Purépecha expanded with measured calculation. Their aim was not to display power, but to preserve it, to extend the shield of the Erecha over the valleys and passes that might otherwise become threats. The first movements pushed westward, toward the mineral-rich Sierra Madre and the Pacific coast. There, copper and salt awaited, along with trade routes to distant lands. The Tarascan armies, disciplined, equipped, and guided by priestly omens, secured these territories with quiet precision. Fortresses rose on ridges. Local rulers were allowed to stay, but only under the watchful eye of noble governors. To the north, expansion met the wild lands of the Chichimeca, fierce and nomadic, unbound by cities or calendar. There, the Tarascans advanced slowly, building forts and roads, offering alliance where conquest proved costly. These lands would remain uneasy, but buffered, a line of defense, not dominion. Eastward lay the heart of challenge, the rising Aztec Empire, centered in Tenochtitlan. The Tarascans did not yet war with them, but their paths were converging. Between them stretched a belt of contested towns and shifting loyalties, the frontier of two great powers, each aware of the other, each wary. In these borderlands, the Purépecha used not only arms, but diplomacy. Spies were sent. Envoys carried messages laced with threat and courtesy. Towns were courted with trade, persuaded with gifts, or warned by the quiet presence of soldiers in the hills. Expansion here was delicate, for to misstep could invite the storm of war. As new lands were added, the Tarascan state adapted. Provinces were created, each with its own governor and tribute responsibilities. Roads were extended, not wide, but sufficient, linking lakes to coast, hill to valley. These routes carried warriors, merchants, and messengers. They were the arteries of empire, and they pulsed with life. Military outposts marked the edge. Small, Fortified towns manned by loyal families served as anchors, reminders that the Orecha's reach did not end at the capital. From these outposts, order was maintained, and the sacred flame kindled even in the far corners of the realm. Yet expansion had its costs. Resources were stretched. Tribute routes grew longer. Cultural tensions rose in distant towns. The farther the realm reached, the more it depended on the discipline of its governors, the loyalty of its soldiers, and the belief of its people in the shared order of the Purépecha world. Still, the expansion succeeded. By the early 16th century, the Tarascan Empire had reached its greatest extent, from the Pacific shore to the valleys near the Aztec border, encompassing countless towns, languages, and landscapes. It was not an empire of spectacle, but of structure. It did not roar, it endured. And now, with borders drawn and power secure, the Tarascans stood ready. For in the east, the Aztec heart beat louder. The two great powers of Mesoamerica, so long content to grow apart, were turning to face one another. The edge of empire had become the edge of fate. While the Purépecha quietly wove their realm into a fabric of lakes, roads, and sacred order, a different kind of empire was rising to the east, bold, rapid, and thunderous. From the swamplands of the Valley of Mexico, the Mexica, later known as the Aztecs, were transforming from wandering outcasts into a force that would redraw the face of Mesoamerica. At first, the Purépecha took little notice. The Valley of Mexico lay far beyond the hills, a world of its own. But as the Mexica formed the Triple Alliance, uniting Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, and began sweeping through the highlands with terrifying speed, the echoes reached the lakes of Michoacan like the distant roll of thunder. The Mexica brought with them a different vision. Their empire thrived on conquest and spectacle. Tribute was demanded not just in goods, but in lives, captives for sacrifice, blood for the sun. Their armies grew vast, their banners feared. Towns fell in days. Markets swelled with goods. Temples rose steep and red. Unlike the Tarascans, who expanded cautiously and ruled through structure, the Mexica expanded with ferocity, integrating regions through intimidation and religious awe. Their gods, led by Huitzilopochtli, called not for balance, but for blood. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, glistened in the sun, a city of canals and causeways, unmatched in scale and ambition. For the Purépecha, this rise brought concern, but not yet panic. They watched. They fortified. They sent scouts eastward and received reports of the Aztecs' growing strength, their changing tactics, their endless hunger for captives. The Tarascan Orecha, wise in counsel and deliberate in movement, ordered that defensive measures be taken. Borders were reinforced. Fortresses repaired. Tribute routes resecured. Military commanders, once focused on frontier skirmishes, now turned their gaze east. The high priests burned incense and watched the stars for signs. The gods, it seemed, stirred uneasily. Still, there was no open war. Between the two realms lay a belt of independent towns, some leaning toward Tenochtitlan, others toward Tsimshian. These cities became the buffer and the battleground of influence. Messengers passed through with gifts, promises, and threats. Loyalties shifted like wind on the lake. The Irecha knew that open conflict would not come from ambition alone. It would come from necessity. The Aztecs, in their hunger for tribute and captives, would eventually seek what the Tarascans held: fertile land, mineral wealth, and strong prisoners for sacrifice. And the Purépecha, bound by oath and custom, would not yield. This looming rivalry was not only of armies, but of world views. The Aztecs believed the sun must be fed with blood to rise. The Purépecha believed in the sacred flame, steady, tended, sustaining life. One sought glory through conquest. The other sought order through preservation. And so the stage was set. The lakes watched. The fires burned. And on the eastern horizon, the storm gathered. The Tarascans, who had long stood apart, would soon be tested, not by rebellion or drought, but by another empire, rising fast, bearing down, and unrelenting. The thunder was still distant, but it was coming. The peace that lingered between the Tarascan and Mexico worlds was always thin, like frost upon a lake, beautiful and brief. By the end of the 15th century, the two great powers of Mesoamerica could no longer avoid each other. The buffer towns between them trembled under growing pressure, and the first cracks began to show along the edge of empire. It began not with declarations, but with skirmishes, sudden raids, disappearances of tribute envoys, rumors whispered in markets. Small Tarascan garrisons in the east reported strange movements, Mexican merchants followed by warriors, emissaries speaking sweet words but hiding sharp intent. Border towns, once quiet, grew restless. The Irecha at the time, Tzitzipandequer, grandson of Tarascan, understood the weight of the moment. He was no passive ruler. Under his command, the Tarascan armies had grown stronger, their metallurgy refined, their borders secured. He dispatched trusted generals to reinforce the frontier, especially in the regions near Taxamaroa, a town whose name would soon be etched into the memory of a people. The Mexica, under the rule of Ahuetzotl, had recently extended their power deep into the south, into Oaxaca and the coast. Emboldened by success and spurred by the need for tribute and captives, they now looked west. The Tarascan lands, with their copper mines, rich fields, and hardened soldiers, became a target both tempting and dangerous. Small conflicts erupted. A Tarascan patrol vanished. A Mexica emissary was turned away at a fortress gate. The Aztecs tested the strength and will of their rivals, probing with words and weapons alike. The Purépecha responded not with panic, but with precision. Watchtowers were manned day and night. Supply lines were fortified. Commanders rotated to keep minds alert and strategies fresh. In these early encounters, a pattern emerged. The Mexica sought captives, the lifeblood of their rituals, while the Tarascans aimed to deny them. Their soldiers fought not to parade prisoners through capital streets, but to defend territory and avoid enslavement. For the Purépecha, capture meant more than death, it meant the possibility of being sacrificed on foreign altars, severed from their gods, their ancestors, their name. And so, the battles remained small but fierce. Neither side committed its full strength. Each waited, testing the other, searching for weakness. but slowly, the inevitability of full conflict grew clear. Villages on the frontier lived in anxiety. Fires were kept low at night. Markets thinned. Scouts returned with reports of Mexican camps growing larger, of new roads cut into the eastern hills. At Tzintzuntzan, the priests read the stars and found no peace in them. The first blood had been drawn. The borderlands trembled under the weight of empire, and the rulers of both nations knew that the time of measured games was ending. Ahead lay something larger, a clash not only of armies, but of visions, fire against sun, endurance against hunger, kingdom against empire. The Purépecha did not yet know when the storm would break in full. But they no longer wondered if it would. It had begun. As tension with the Mexica deepened, the Tarascan response did not come with grand declarations or sweeping marches. It came with stone and strategy, quiet movements across the frontier, where watchtowers rose like fingers of warning, and earthworks reshaped the land into a barrier not easily crossed. The Purépecha did not believe in wars of spectacle. Their strength lay in preparation, and so they turned their focus to the border, a long, uncertain line running from the valleys near Toluca to the hills south of Taxamaroa. It was not marked by banners, but by fortresses, garrison towns, and the watchful silence of soldiers who knew what approached. These fortifications were not immense citadels, but practical strongholds, built of stone, earth, and wood. They followed the shape of the land, set on ridges, river crossings, and mountain passes. From their heights, one could see far across the fields, and more importantly, be seen. Each outpost was manned by a rotating force of warriors drawn from local and noble lineages. They lived in simple barracks, trained daily, and responded quickly to any sign of intrusion. Their orders were clear: observe, resist, report. If necessary, retreat, but never without leaving the enemy marked. Among the most fortified zones was the region around Taxamaroa, a town perched near the strategic routes from the Valley of Mexico. Here, the earth itself had been shaped into defensive lines, ditches, raised paths, and watch posts, forming what some would later call a defensive wall. Though modest by modern standards, it was a rare feat in Mesoamerica, an organized attempt to hold space, not just claim it. Behind the frontier lay a second line of support towns, ready to send reinforcements or supplies. Messengers, swift, trained, and sacred to the state, ran between them carrying codes, warnings, and orders sealed in ash. The entire system functioned like a nervous system, pulsing with urgency but avoiding panic. This was defense rooted in philosophy. The Purépecha saw their realm not just as land, but as sacred space, a body held together by fire, tribute, and ritual. To let it be breached was to invite not only conquest, but cosmic imbalance. Every hilltop guard post was a ritual point, a place where the gods were asked to watch and the people were reminded of their unity. Weapons were sharpened, arrowheads and copper blades forged, armor of thick cotton and wood prepared. The Tarascan smiths, long masters of metallurgy, increased the production of metal tools and ornaments, some of which doubled as war gear. Unlike their eastern rivals, they saw the practical use of metal in battle. But still, they waited. Their strategy was not to strike first. It was to withstand, to absorb the blow, to let the enemy tire against the stone, and then to answer with force and precision. These preparations were not done in fear, but in resolve. For the Purépecha had no illusions. The Aztecs would come. The only question was when. And when they did, they would find no open gates, no fractured order, no panic in the streets. They would find a kingdom ready, not for conquest, but for resistance. Not to expand, but to endure. The lines had been drawn, and the earth itself was prepared to hold. It came at last, as all tensions do, not with whispers, but with war. The Mexica had tested the Purépecha long enough. In the year now remembered with solemn pride, they struck. The target was Taxamaroa, the fortified gateway to the heart of the Tarascan realm. And what followed would be remembered as the moment two empires truly met, not in diplomacy, but in blood. The Mexica campaign was led by Axayacatl, one of the fiercest and most ambitious rulers of Tenochtitlan. Flush with victories to the south and confident in his growing army, he saw the Tarascan lands not only as rich in tribute, but essential to expanding Mexica prestige. To conquer them would be to eclipse all rivals. He gathered a force unlike any before, tens of thousands of warriors, drawn from allied cities, battle-hardened and adorned in eagle and jaguar regalia. With fanfare and omen, they marched westward, through the border towns and into the frontier. Waiting for them was the Aricha Tsitsipandaque and his generals, who had long prepared for this day. The defenders of Taxamaroa were fewer in number but well positioned. They held the high ground, the choke points, and the fortified routes. More importantly, they held a different kind of strength, knowledge of the land, coordination, and resolve born of defending home. The battle that followed was brutal and prolonged. For days, the hills rang with the clash of obsidian and copper, with cries of war and smoke from fires set to fields and camps. The Mexica fought with their usual ferocity, aiming to take captives, break lines, and rush the center. But they met something new. The Tarascans did not fight for sacrifice or tribute. They fought for preservation. Their warriors held formation, struck with precision, and made use of metal-tipped weapons that did not shatter on impact. Their defensive lines forced the Mexica into narrow passes, where numbers mattered less and discipline more. The defenders were tireless. Reinforcements came in waves from nearby towns, organized and expected. Supplies flowed through hidden paths. Priests stood on ridge tops, burning offerings, invoking Curicori, and calling upon ancestral spirits. Axayacatl, though fierce, had misjudged. His men, unaccustomed to a sustained defense of this kind, grew weary. Morale faltered. Attempts to flank the defenders were met with ambushes. The Tarascan generals, trained for this very war, turned each Mexica advance into a trap. After heavy losses and no decisive gain, the Mexica withdrew. Not routed, but defeated. Their dead were left on the field. Their pride, deeply wounded. For the Purépecha, this was more than a victory, it was vindication. The fire had held. The empire had endured. The Mexica would not return to challenge Tarascan territory again. A cold respect settled between the two powers, not alliance, but acknowledgement. In a world where all others had fallen beneath Aztec feet, the Tarascan stood, not through might alone, but through structure, readiness, and belief. The Battle of Taxamaroa became legend. Songs were sung of the hill forts, of the copper blades, of the priests who danced in smoke as arrows fell. And in the capital of Tzintzuntzan, the sacred fire burned brighter than ever, not just as a symbol of divine favor, but as a proof of identity. Two empires had met. Only one had advanced. The other had endured. In the annals of Mesoamerica, few peoples understood the spirit of metal as deeply as the Purépecha. Where others shaped obsidian and jade, the Tarascans forged copper, not as ornament alone, but as instrument, as shield, and as sword. It was a quiet power, honed in furnaces, that gave them a rare edge when empire pressed against empire. The heart of this strength lay in the western highlands, where mineral-rich veins cut through the earth like hidden rivers. For generations, the Purépecha had mined copper, silver, and gold, but it was copper, humble, strong, and abundant, that became the backbone of their resistance. In the hills near Santa Clara del Coba and Tzintzuntzan, workshops buzzed with activity. Bellows fed the fires. Crucibles glowed red-hot. Skilled smiths, guided by ancestral knowledge and divine blessing, hammered, cast, and shaped the metal into tools and weapons. Unlike the Aztecs, who prized obsidian for its cutting-edge but fragile nature, the Purépecha recognized copper's durability. They crafted axes, knives, spearheads, and arrow tips, tools that withstood the impact of battle. Their armor included metal-studded shields, and some warriors wore copper breastplates, rare in Mesoamerica. These weapons did not shimmer with gold, nor dazzle with inlay. They were practical, lethal, and efficient, silent companions to the warriors who defended the realm. In the fields of Taxamaroa, they had proven their worth. Obsidian shattered against copper. Mexica blades cracked and fell. The Tarascan warriors stood. But the value of metallurgy extended beyond war. Copper bells rang in ceremonies, their soft chimes calling spirits and ancestors. Needles and chisels aided in craft and construction. Jewelry, though plain compared to the opulence of other cultures, bore symbols of power and status, not just beauty, but belonging. Metalwork was a sacred craft, passed from generation to generation. Smiths were respected, their work considered a gift from the gods. They did not simply melt and shape, they listened to the metal, observed its color, its hiss, its readiness to transform. Each piece bore not just the hand of the maker, but the memory of the mountain from which it came. The state supported this craft. Mines were guarded. Tribute often included raw ore. Some smiths worked directly under noble patronage, supplying arms and ritual items. Others served their villages, crafting tools that made daily life possible. All were part of the greater whole. And it was this mastery, quiet, skilled, enduring, that helped the Tarascan realm stand apart. While others chased feathers and jade, the Purépecha wielded copper. While others glorified display, they prepared for resistance. Their advantage lay not in numbers, nor in spectacle, but in a furnace's glow, the the silent art of turning stone into strength. This was the metal advantage. Not just in war, but in identity. A kingdom shaped not only by fire from the heavens, but fire from the earth. After the smoke cleared from the hills of Taxamaroa and the Mexica armies withdrew, silence did not return to the land. In its place came something quieter, more enduring, a different kind of war. No longer fought with blades alone, it was waged with envoys, whispers, trade routes, and trust. It was a cold war, stretched across valleys and rivers, where power shifted not by conquest, but by cunning. The Tarascan victory had earned them not peace, but Mexica attention. The Aztec rulers, stunned by their first true repulse, realized that the Purépecha were not a problem to be solved with brute force. They were a rival to be managed. And so began the years of subtle struggle, when both empires sought to shape the land between them, not with swords, but with influence. Messengers became as important as generals. Diplomats from Tenochtitlan journeyed west, bearing gifts and threats, seeking alliances with towns along the Tarascan frontier. They promised trade, protection, prestige, and in return, asked for tribute, for allegiance, for watchful eyes. The Purépecha answered with envoys of their own. Their emissaries spoke softly, carried symbols of the sacred fire, and reminded border communities of the strength that had held the Mexica back. They did not bribe. They reassured, invoking memory, tradition, and shared fear of the East. Spies moved through markets, posing as merchants. Information became a weapon. Reports flowed back to Tzintzuntzan, who was loyal, who was wavering, who had received a Mexica priest or a secret gift. The Aricha's court kept detailed maps, not of geography alone, but of loyalties, constantly updated, constantly shifting. Along trade routes, this shadow war deepened. The Mexica sought to reroute goods south, bypassing Tarascan markets. In response, the Purépecha strengthened their own corridors, offered better prices, and ensured safety for traveling merchants. Trade diplomacy became central policy, not only to preserve the economy, but to keep hearts close. Religious influence, too, became a quiet battlefield. The Mexica, proud of their pantheon and their temples, tried to extend the reach of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. Small shrines appeared in contested towns. Mexica priests offered new festivals, new rituals. But the Purépecha, rooted in their own sacred order, countered with Curacora's fire, with moon rites of Zaratanga, with ancestral reverence that no outsider could mimic. At times, the Cold War grew warmer. A town might refuse to pay tribute. A Tarascan patrol might intercept a Mexica caravan. These sparks were often contained, but the message was clear: both sides remained alert, armed, and waiting. Yet despite the tension, neither empire crossed the line again. The cost of war was too high, the memory of Taxamaroa too fresh. And so they watched each other from afar, each believing in the superiority of their order, each unwilling to bend. In this long twilight, the Purépecha did not seek expansion. They sought preservation of their borders, their identity, their sacred flame. And they succeeded, not by silencing the Mexica, but by outlasting their ambition. for war is not always won by battle. Sometimes, it is won by patience, by diplomacy, by knowing where to hold and where to endure. And in the valleys between two empires, that lesson became history. In the aftermath of battle, when neither sword nor arrow could bend the will of empires, came the oldest tool of power, words. Between St. Sunson and Tenochtitlan, across the guarded borders and watchful hills, messengers rode not with threats, but with scrolls and seals, bearing questions more difficult than war. Could two empires coexist? Could fire and sun share the sky? It was in this strange and uneasy quiet that the Mexica extended a hand, or at least, the shadow of one. After their defeat at Taxamaroa and the realization that brute force would not breach the Purépecha realm, voices within the Mexica court began to speak not of conquest, but of alliance. It was a radical thought. The Mexica, proud of their triple alliance, rarely treated others as equals. But the Tarascans had done what none before them had. They had resisted and endured. They held rich lands, powerful warriors, and an empire not of show, but of strength. Perhaps, some Mexica leaders thought, they were better as partners than prey. And so emissaries were sent. Not soldiers, but noble diplomats, wrapped in fine cloaks, bearing gifts of cacao, feathers, obsidian blades, and jade. They crossed the valleys carefully, flanked by honor guards, pausing at each fortress, respectful of every boundary. When they reached St. Sunson, they were received not with celebration, but with ceremony, the Tarascan way. They presented their proposal, not surrender, not submission, but cooperation. A treaty of trade. An alliance against distant foes. A pact, perhaps, to share tribute routes or defend border towns from unruly bands. There were whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, that some Mexica even suggested intermarriage between noble houses, binding the empires not in war, but in blood. The Tarascan court, led by a cautious Iricha and his council of priests and nobles, listened. They listened, and they paused. To accept such an alliance would mean recognition, yes, but also risk. Would it draw them into Mexico wars? Would it be a slow erosion of sovereignty? Could one share a table with an empire whose gods demanded human hearts? And yet, there was temptation. Trade could flourish. Borders could quiet. There was strength in dialogue, just as there was danger in silence. Debate filled the halls of the capital. Some nobles urged caution, others saw opportunity. Priests consulted the stars and found them clouded. The sacred fire was stoked higher, not just for ritual, but for clarity. Curicori, it seemed, offered no easy answer. In the end, the Purépecha gave a reply on neither yes nor no, but a message in their own form. They thanked the Mexica for their recognition, affirmed the desire for peace, offered trade but refused entanglement. They would stand alongside, but not beneath. They would speak across the fire, but not let it dim. The emissaries returned, gifts in hand, their faces unreadable. And so the alliance that might have changed history never took root. Not out of enmity, but out of deep and mutual understanding, that two suns cannot rise in the same sky, and that some fires are meant to burn apart, not together. The Tarascan realm, cautious and steady, chose distance over dependence. They would stand alone, not in pride, but in protection of all they had built. Words had been spoken, but the silence that followed said just as much. By the early 16th century, as the Aztec Empire reached the height of its power, it had cast its shadow across nearly all of central Mexico. From the Gulf to the Pacific, from Chiapas to the northern deserts, town after town had bent the knee. Tribute flowed like rivers into the heart of Tenochtitlan: cacao, cotton, feathers, captives. Everywhere the Mexica sun burned bright. Everywhere but west. There, in the highlands of Michoacan, the Mexica found their advance stopped, not by terrain, not by fate, but by a people who had built their kingdom not for glory, but for resilience. The Tarascans were not the largest empire, nor the most ostentatious, but they were the only ones who could not be broken. The border between the two empires, long tested, skirmished over, and courted through diplomacy, had solidified into a kind of standstill. Though no wall of stone stretched across the hills, the Tarascan frontier became, in practice, the western wall of the Mexica world. And it held. In the east, the Mexica boasted of dominion over 100 peoples. But in the west, their maps ended not with conquest, but with caution. The towns closest to the border, Toluca, Malinalco, and others, learned to walk carefully, offering tribute one way and loyalty another, caught in the quiet pull of two powers. The Purépecha, for their part, never sought to conquer Tenochtitlan. Their strength lay in containment, not expansion. They poured their resources into defense, building roads that bypassed conflict zones, reinforcing watchposts, deepening alliances with loyal towns. Their generals trained not in showy parades but in discipline, coordination, and endurance. They remained vigilant, always. Spies continued to cross the border, carrying not blades, but questions: had the Mexica moved their garrisons? Were new temples being raised in frontier towns? What did the tribute lists from the eastern valleys reveal about intention? In Tzintzuntzan, the fire of Curacory burned day and night, a constant presence atop the Yucata platforms. It reminded the people that they were still free, still sovereign. And more than that, they were the only ones left. The Tarascan kingdom became a symbol of resistance, not only to their own people but to others watching from afar. If the mighty Mexica could be held at bay, then the world was not yet conquered. There remained corners of independence, of difference, of a sacred fire untouched by the imperial sun. For the Mexica, the Tarascans became both frustration and recognition. They spoke rarely of them in open court, but always with measured respect. They had learned that not all power could be overcome. Some power, like the stone Yucatas themselves, must simply be acknowledged. And so the border held, not by accident, but by centuries of planning, patience, and purpose. It was the final frontier of a divided world, and in its quiet endurance, the Tarascan realm stood as the last kingdom never conquered. The lakes remained still. The mountains watched. And the fire, always, burned on. The lakes of Michoacan, still and ancient, reflected a sky that had seen much. The people of the Purépecha moved through their days in rhythm with the earth, planting, weaving, offering thanks to the gods. But in the hush between seasons, a new kind of wind began to stir. It came not from the mountains, nor from the valleys. It came from the sea. At first, it was only rumor, carried by salt-stained traders from the coast, by wandering hunters, by Nawa messengers with uncertain eyes. They spoke of men who rode beasts with hooves, of thunder made from stone, and of skin pale as bark. They spoke of ships, larger than temples, floating on the sea like drifting islands. And most chilling of all, they spoke of death without warning, illness that struck the body like fire and left no time for prayer. These stories reached St. Sunson slowly, cautiously, wrapped in uncertainty. The nobles gathered in their halls, listening to each new report with a quiet that bordered on reverence. The priest stood long before the sacred fire, searching its tongues of flame for guidance. The signs were unclear, but heavy. Something approached, not an army, not a messenger, but a change. To the east, the Mexica had begun to falter. Not from battle, but from sickness. The news was impossible to ignore. Whole noble houses had vanished. Even Moctezuma, ruler of the mighty Tenochtitlan, had fallen. And with him, the sun that had ruled the Valley of Mexico began to dim. But no strangers had yet come to the Purépecha lands. No sails were seen on the lake. No foreign foot had crossed their soil. Still, the illness arrived. Without a single Spaniard present, it entered the kingdom on the breath of a traveler, or in the cough of a messenger. It claimed Zuangwa, the Kazonsai himself, before a single word could be exchanged with those from beyond the sea. This was not conquest. It was invasion by silence. Fear took no loud form. There were no riots, no screams. But across the empire, doors closed earlier. Fires were kept burning longer. Sacred places were cleansed more often. People prayed not for victory, but for endurance. Fields were tended with gentler hands. The sick were cared for with whispered rites. And in the palace of St. Sunson, a new ruler, Tangaksoan II, stepped forward, facing not just a realm wounded, but a future unknown. No war had been declared. No treaty offered. And yet, the world was changing. It had arrived not with armies, but with breath and shadow. And the people of the lakes, who had once stood unbowed before the Aztec spear, now stood before something far stranger, the unseen. The murmurs of the sea had become real. And though the strangers had not yet spoken, their presence was already felt, in sickness, in silence, in the turning of the age. The sky above St. Sunson darkened not with storm, but with memory. The news, when it came, did not roar. It arrived quietly, like a final breath. Tenochtitlan had fallen. Messengers crossed the lakes with heavy steps. In their eyes, the reflection of a world undone. The great city of the Mexica, lords of the valley, terror of towns and taker of hearts, had been conquered by the very strangers whose names were still uncertain in the Purépecha tongue. They had come from across the sea, it was said, led by a man named Cortez, clad in iron and riding beasts never seen before. They fought beside other natives, enemies of the Aztecs, now turned allies. Their weapons split stone and pierced shields. But it was not only steel that unmade the empire, it was plague, despair, and betrayal. For the first time in living memory, the sun of the east had been eclipsed. In the Purépecha capital, the fire still burned. But around it, the world had changed. The priests gathered, not in triumph, but in wonder. Could this be a sign of favor from the gods? Or a warning? Had Kurikori protected his people once more, or had a greater power crossed the sea? The new Eritrea, Tangaksoan too, was a thoughtful man. He had inherited the throne after the death of his father, Zuangwa, who had been among the first in the kingdom to fall to the unseen sickness. Tangaksoan had grown up in the shadow of conflict with the Mexica and had ruled in the quiet peace that followed. Now, he faced a silence more dangerous than war. Envoys from the east began to arrive, cautious, curious, unsteady in their bearing. They brought not only gifts, but questions. The strangers, Spaniards, they called themselves, were asking about the West. They spoke of alliance, of God, of gold. And though they came as few, the memory of what they had done in Tenochtitlan made even their quiet words thunderous. The Eritrea did not move in haste. He consulted his council, his priests, his dreams. The Purépecha had never bowed to the Mexica, not in battle, not in tribute. And yet, now, the world itself had shifted. The threat was no longer another empire. It was something deeper, a force that unmade what seemed unshakable. Tangaksoan sent gifts. He offered words of peace. He allowed the strangers to pass, but watched them closely. He did not kneel. He did not raise arms. Instead, he waited, trying to understand if these were men, gods, or omens sent by a world now turning faster than before. And so the lake stood quiet. The fields grew on. The sacred fire burned. But above all, the people watched the sky, no longer sure if it held their fate, or if fate had come ashore from distant oceans. The Mexica had fallen. But the Purépecha still stood. For how long, none could say. He had ruled in peace, but died in silence. Zuangwa, Kazonsai of the Tarascans, was not a warrior king. He had not marched to the frontier with copper spear in hand, nor had he stood before foreign thrones demanding submission. His reign, though not long, was marked by stillness, by the watchful calm of a kingdom that had outlasted conquest and held its border like stone against wind. But in the final months of his life, a different kind of enemy crossed that border, one without armies, without drums, without warning. It was smallpox, the foreign breath that had emptied cities in the east and darkened the sun above Tenochtitlan. It crept into the Purépecha realm unseen, carried, perhaps, by a trader or a messenger, or by the very wind that rustled the maize fields. No swords were drawn. No scouts raised the alarm. There was no time. When Zuangwa fell ill, the court whispered at first. A cough, a fever. Nothing the priests had not soothed before. Offerings were made, fires kept high, chants spoken through the night. But the heat did not break. Instead, it deepened. His skin darkened. His breathing failed. The palace grew hushed. Outside, the people did not yet know. Within, the priests watched helplessly. They had faced war. They had read omens in fire and moon. But they could not read this. In a matter of days, the Kazonsai was gone. The sacred guardians carried his body in ritual silence. The nobles did not wail. They stood in stiff sorrow, faces painted with ash. No enemy had breached the walls, but the king had died nonetheless, claimed by something without name, without face, without mercy. There was no great battle. No funeral pyre. Just a vacancy, a sudden emptiness beneath the crown. The people mourned quietly. The farmers in the hills offered their first fruits to the gods in trembling hands. Mothers lit candles of lake wax. Dancers moved slower in the temple courts. And in the sacred precinct of Tsinsunsun, the fire of Kurikorai was fed not for victory, but for endurance. Zuangwa had left behind no grand monuments, no walls of war. Only a realm, wounded, uncertain, but whole. His death marked the first breach in the stone, the first whisper that something had changed. He was the last ruler of a world untouched. After him came winds from the sea. When Zuangwa died, the kingdom did not fall. The fires were not extinguished. The temples did not crumble. The people, as they had always done, turned to the sacred rhythm, to ritual, to memory, to the balance that had kept them through storms. And from the noble house of kings, another rose. Tangaksoan too, son of Zuangwa, was young but known. He had been raised in the palace halls, taught by priests and generals, guided through the ancient rites that shaped the Purépecha world. He knew the shape of governance, the weight of copper, and the names of every province from the lake shores to the frontier mines. But what he faced was unlike anything his ancestors had prepared for. When Tangaksoan took the throne, the kingdom was already shifting. The Mexica had fallen. Foreigners, the Spaniards, moved across the valleys like smoke, arriving in small numbers but carrying voices louder than armies. They came with steel and strange gods, with translators and banners bearing the sign of the cross. They were fewer than the Tarascan army could crush, yet they were treated not as invaders, but as something else. Tangaksoan too chose patience. He did not send warriors. He did not close his borders. He watched. He listened. His counselors debated. Some urged resistance, the same strength that had repelled the Aztecs. Others feared this new foe, not for their numbers, but for the ruin they left behind. Towns that once thrived were now silent. People vanished not by blade, but by breath. Even the gods seemed quiet. In 1522, Tangaksoan sent emissaries to the Spanish commander Cristobal de Olid, who had advanced west from the ruined Aztec heartland. The message was clear: the Purépecha would not fight. They would receive the strangers. They would offer peace, tribute, even hospitality, but they would not bend without understanding. It was not surrender. It was a measured offering, a test. The Spaniards entered Tsinsunsun without resistance. They found a city clean and vast, with temples raised like stepped hills, and a ruler who did not cower. Tangixoan met them with composure. He offered gold, food, and deference, not because he believed them divine, but because he sensed the danger of their wrath and the fragility of his people. In that moment, a decision was made, not in conquest, but in calculation. Tangixoan hoped to preserve what could be saved, the people, the cities, the sacred order, even if it now moved under a darker sun. But with the strangers came not peace, but ambition. Their demands grew. Their patience waned. And the Kazonsai, once firm in his balance, found himself caught between honor and survival. He was the last to sit upon the throne of the Aricha. The last to rule not by Spanish will, but by fire and ancestral name. His reign was not marked by wars won, but by the impossible choice between resistance and ruin. And as the shadow of the cross lengthened across the land, the fires still burned, but more quietly now, as if waiting to see whether the gods, too, would speak. Tangixoan too had not fallen. But the world beneath his feet was shifting. And even a king could not hold the earth still. The year was 1522, and the world of the Purépecha stood upon a precipice. The mighty Mexica, once invincible in song and sword, had crumbled before strangers whose power came not only from weapons, but from a force more elusive of a will to remake the world in the image of their own gods. In Tzintzuntzan, Tangixoan too weighed what had never been weighed before. The fire still burned on the yukata platforms. Tribute still flowed. But something older than stone had begun to shift. From the east came Cristobal de Olid, sent by Hernan Cortés, with banners of red and gold, crosses held high, and voices speaking of both peace and dominion. The strangers did not arrive as raiders. They came as emissaries, riding into the highlands with a strange mix of reverence and expectation. They had heard of the Purépecha's wealth, of their copper and their order, of a kingdom that had never bowed to the Mexica and might yet offer alliance, or defiance. Tangixoan chose neither war nor silence. He received the Spaniards. He offered them tribute, not in chains, but in gesture. Gold ornaments, copper tools, cloaks, food, guides. Not as subjects, but as hosts. To his council, the Kazonsai spoke plainly, they are not gods. They are not our kin. But their fire is new, and their shadow wide. He did not bend the knee. He stood firm, but he opened the gates, hoping that diplomacy might preserve what arms could not. The first encounter was calm. The Spaniards marveled at the city, its neat streets, its sacred architecture, its people, dignified and orderly. They saw no savagery here, no need for the sword. For a time, they spoke of peace. Tangixoan offered submission, but not humiliation. His gesture was strategic. If the strangers sought tribute, they would receive it. If they sought travel, they would be guided. But the heart of the realm, its traditions, its sacred rites, was not surrendered. And for a moment, it seemed the gamble might succeed. But beneath the courteous exchange lay danger. The Spaniards came not only for land or gold. They came with a cross, and with it, the demand for souls. They saw the fire of Curacorai not as sacred, but as false. They spoke of baptism, of one God and one kingdom under heaven, not just on earth. Still, Tangaksoan did not provoke. He watched. He listened. He sent gifts to Cortés himself, not from fear, but from forethought. Perhaps, he hoped, accommodation might buy peace. Perhaps coexistence was still possible. But the tides had turned. The Spaniards were no longer cautious explorers, they were now conquerors with victories behind them and governorships to claim. What had begun in strategy now leaned toward subjugation. The crown of the Aricha remained on Tangaksoan's brow, but he could feel its weight shift, as if another hand now reached for it. He had made his choice, not out of weakness, but for the sake of the realm. And yet, in offering peace, he had invited those who knew not how to hold it. The cross had entered his world, not as light, but as judgment. And soon, the banner beneath which he stood would no longer ask for gold alone. It would ask for his kingdom. And his life. The lakes no longer whispered peace. Their surface, once calm, now mirrored a sky troubled by omen and ash. The sacred fires still burned, but their warmth no longer reached the people as it once had. Something in the heart of the kingdom had shifted, not by battle, but by betrayal. When the Spaniards first entered the land, they were few and cautious. Tangaksoan too had received them with care. He offered tribute not in surrender, but in wisdom, seeking peace in a world turned unfamiliar. But the fire that once protected the kingdom from the Aztec tide could not protect it from Nuno de Guzman. He came not as a guest, but as a storm disguised in velvet. Appointed to govern, he arrived bearing the authority of a distant king and the ambition of his own heart. The Kazonsai met him in good faith, as he had with others. He offered food, gold, goodwill. And for this, he was seized, bound, and broken. They say Guzman demanded gold, more than what had been given. When Tangaksoan could not provide what did not exist, he was tortured. His dignity stripped, his voice ignored, the last king of the Purépecha was dragged by a horse through the streets of his own capital, then burned alive in public view. Thus ended the line of the Aricha, not in war, not in ceremony, but in fire turned cruel. No enemy had breached the walls. The gates had not fallen. Instead, the conqueror had been welcomed, and with that welcome came ruin. The people stood helpless. The priests wept beside their altars. The nobles scattered. The sacred order that had endured for centuries collapsed in a single breath. This was not a conquest by sword. It was the unraveling of trust, a peace taken and twisted. A throne stolen not by battle, but by deceit. The realm did not die, but it ceased to be free. Puppet rulers were placed upon what remained of the throne. Spanish governors issued commands from stone halls that once echoed only with the voice of kings. The copper tools, the tribute systems, the temple songs, all continued, but hollowed, like shells abandoned by the tide. Yet the people remained. Broken, yes, but not erased. In silence, they remembered. And the fire, though dimmed, still burned, not in the palaces, but in the hearts of those who refused to forget. After the fires of betrayal, when the last king's voice had been silenced by cruelty, the Purépecha lands lay in sorrow. The stone roads no longer echoed with the footsteps of tribute-bearers. The Yakartas stood quiet, like sentinels watching over a people who now wandered without a crown. It was in this bleak and uncertain twilight that Vasco de Quiroga arrived. He came not as a soldier, nor with sword or threat. He came as a bishop, an older man, learned and deliberate. Where others sought gold, he brought books. Where others struck fear, he spoke of justice. And though he could not undo what had been done, he came with a vision not of empire, but of healing. The people, weary and wounded, looked upon him with cautious eyes. They had seen promises before, and watched them burn. But Quiroga did not demand. He listened. He saw a kingdom broken not only in body but in spirit, towns without leaders, temples without rites, children without guidance. The order that had once bound the Purépecha world, through fire, tribute, and sacred rhythm, had been shattered. But not erased. Quiroga began gently. He gathered the people in hospital towns, which he called pueblos hospitals. Inspired by visions of peace and equality, he built communities where the people could live, farm, and worship together, not as subjects, but as families. Each town had its church, its school, its place of work. He encouraged craftsmanship, education, and fair law. He did not seek to restore the empire, nor did he revive the sacred fire of Curacorai. But he preserved the people, their knowledge, their language, their dignity. He learned Purépecha. He spoke it in sermons. He defended the people in court. He wrote laws on their behalf. And while the distant crown in Spain turned its gaze to other conquests, Quiroga remained steady, kind, and unbending in his defense of those whom the world had sought to forget. To the Purépecha, he became Tata Vasco, Father Vasco. Not just a bishop, but a guardian of memory. Under his care, the people began to breathe again. They worked the land, raised families, and whispered to their children the stories of the lakes, the temples, the kings, and the time before. It was not empire. It was not freedom. But it was life, and it endured. In time, Quiroga passed on. His bones were laid to rest not in distant cathedrals, but in the land he had chosen, among the people he had come not to rule, but to serve. And in the quiet valleys of Mycocan, long after the armies had marched away and the banners had faded, the embers of a world still glowed, not in stone, but in hearts. A new rhythm, slower and quieter, had taken root. For even after the fire has dimmed, the warmth remains. Long after the banners had changed, after kings were no longer crowned and the fire no longer burned on the Yakartas, the Purépecha did not vanish. They remained, not in palaces or great temples, but in the valleys, the villages, and the hills where time moved more slowly and memory lingered like mist on morning fields. The sacred rhythms of the old world had been interrupted, but they had not been erased. In homes of adobe and stone, by hearths where corn was ground and children gathered, stories continued. The names of Tariacuri and Tangaxoan were whispered. The old gods were remembered in silence, their names spoken not in prayer, but in respect. Even if the rites had ceased, the memory remained. What endured most powerfully, however, was language. The Purépecha tongue, unlike the languages of many conquered peoples, did not dissolve. It survived, passed from mother to child, from grandfather to grandson. It flowed through lullabies, through blessings, through the quiet negotiations of daily life. It was not the language of empire any longer, but it was still the language of belonging. Even the Spaniards, those who governed from distant towns or church towers, recognized its persistence. Vasco de Quiroga, in his wisdom, encouraged its use, knowing that a people stripped of their language is a people lost. Through the centuries, Purépecha remained on the tongues of farmers, weavers, midwives, and potters. It was spoken in the fields, sung during harvest, whispered to the earth during planting. In these hills, time did not forget. Crafts continued, not as tribute, but as tradition. Copper work endured in Santa Clara. Lacquerware in Uruapan. Ceramics, textiles, and music carried patterns older than memory. Each design, each shape, each song was an echo, not of empire, but of a people who had refused to vanish. Churches rose, yes. Crosses crowned the plazas. But beneath the Christian rites, the Purépecha soul remained, quieter, humbler, but whole. The mountains still watched. The lakes still breathed. And the people, though no longer ruled by kings, still belonged to their land. Their survival was not dramatic. It was not carved in stone. It was woven, lived, spoken. It was not resistance in battle, but resistance in being. And so, in the quiet places of my Kokan, the old world continued, not as it was, but as it could be. In language. In memory. In the hills. A civilization once strong enough to halt the Aztec tide had become something greater still, a people who remembered. The lakes of my Kokan had seen kings rise and fall. They had mirrored the stone of temples and the sails of foreign ships. Yet through all the changes, the noise of conquest, the silence of loss, the lakes remained. They were never just water. To the Purépecha, they were living mirrors, spirits in motion, keepers of memory. Pátzcuaro, Zirahuan, Quetzio, each name older than writing, older than rule. These waters had nourished the people and the land, but they had also held their stories, their songs, and their dead. Long before the Spaniards came, the lakes were sacred. The island of Janitzio, floating like a crown upon Pátzcuaro's surface, was not just a home, it was a place of ancestors. There, the departed were honored, their memory kept alive through offering and prayer. Even as churches rose and crosses replaced the fire altars, the lake still whispered their names. Fishermen moved across its glassy face with quiet purpose, their canoes guided more by memory than by map. The nets they cast, shaped like butterfly wings, were not just tools but rituals. In each movement was a rhythm handed down from those who had once served the Aricha, who had once guarded the shores when Mexica scouts dared not approach. The Yakartas of Tzintzuntzan still stood above the lake, silent and weathered. No incense burned there now. No priests climbed with offerings. But the stones remembered. And when rain fell, as it had for centuries, it pooled in the hollows of those stones, as if the gods still drank from them. The natural world, though altered, had not forgotten the old paths. Birds still circled the sacred groves. The wind still swept through the high passes with the same breath it had carried to Tarascan's ears. Trees stood where councils once met. And in the quiet spaces between village and water, there were places where children would stumble on fragments of obsidian, on worn shards of ceramic, the unwritten story, waiting. The new faith spoke of one God, one heaven, one truth. But the land remembered many truths, layered and interwoven like reed mats. The mountains did not forget the names of the old gods. The lake still held the reflections of those who had once spoken to stars and fire. And though the priests of the cross had tried to write a single story, the earth told another, the story of what endured. The Purépecha world was not dead. It was not vanished. It had become quieter, yes, less seen, less spoken of. But it was still there, beneath the surface, like stones under clear water. Waiting. Watching. And always remembering. In the quiet villages that dotted the valleys and lakefronts of Mykokan, life carried on, not with the thunder of empire, but with the soft rhythm of craft. Where temples once echoed with the chants of priests, now courtyards rang with the tap of hammers, the scratch of carving tools, the hum of weaving. The empire was gone, but its soul remained, passed not through decree, but through hands. The Purépecha had long been masters of material. In their height, they had worked copper with a precision unmatched in all Mesoamerica. It had given them not only weapons, but identity. Even now, in the town of Santa Clara del Coba, that legacy burned bright. The forges still glowed. The anvils still sang. Fathers taught sons, mothers taught daughters, and the language of flame and metal passed down, generation after generation. Each bowl, each plate, each bell forged was not just an object, it was a link. A remembrance of the hands that once crafted breastplates for warriors, tools for harvest, and ceremonial vessels for fire offerings. The designs may have changed. The purpose may have shifted. But the gesture, the devotion, remained. In Capula, Tsinsunsun, and Uruapan, the same story unfolded in different forms. Potters shaped clay with fingers worn smooth by time, creating vessels that seemed to breathe. Some bore flowers and birds, others the faces of saints. Yet beneath the glaze, the spirit of the old world slept, gently, silently, like a dream not yet forgotten. Weavers worked at backstrap looms, threading patterns so old they could not name their origin. Motifs from before conquest found their way into modern cloth, spirals, feathers, waves, symbols whose meanings lingered in the fingers, even if not always on the tongue. In the schools Quiroga had helped raise, the crafts were taught not only as skill, but as honor. For in each finished piece was a story of survival, of culture, of resistance not through arms, but through creation. The Spanish governors may have ruled in name, and their churches may have reshaped the skyline, but in kitchens, in workshops, in the corners of shaded patios, the inheritance of hands remained sovereign. Every copper bowl, every embroidered shawl, every lacquered tray, these were not merely products. They were echoes. They were prayers. They were the memory of a people who had once stood against empires, and who now, through labor and love, stood still. And in this quiet persistence, the Purépecha spirit endured. Not by shouting, not by swords, but by making, by remembering, by keeping their world alive, one hand-shaped piece at a time. Long before Spaniards crossed the sea, before Aztec ambition reached the western mountains, there had been a vision, one that lived not in conquest, but in unity. That vision belonged to a man named Tarascan. He was no king when he began. He was a priest, a dreamer, a man of deep thought and deeper purpose. Guided, it was said, by a vision granted by the god Purépecha, he had seen the rise of a people strong not through war alone, but through kinship, order, and sacred fire. Tarascan did not build an empire overnight. He built alliances. He wove together towns through marriage, pacts, and reverence. He spoke not as a warlord, but as a guide, gathering around him nephews and sons who would become the founders of cities, Hiquingue, Tangatame, and Hayapan, names that would one day rule the lakes. He placed his family across the land, not to hoard power, but to share it wisely. It was not greed, but balance that shaped his dream, a kingdom that could withstand the winds of the Valley of Mexico and yet remain rooted in its own mountain soil. The Tarascan state, with its temples, roads, laws, and rituals, had not sprung from ambition alone. It had grown from a vision of unity, of a people gathered beneath fire, guided by discipline, bound by language and law. Even after the fall of kings, that vision did not vanish. In every village that remembered the sacred hills of Tzintzuntzan, in every pot painted with the spiral motifs of the past, in every child taught the old words of the ancestors, Tarascan's dream endured. Not in palaces or golden thrones, but in the idea that a people could be more than subjects. That they could be a nation. Long before such a word was written, the Purépecha had lived it. They had stood together, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And in that choice was strength. Today, his name still carries meaning in the land of his birth. Schools bear it. Songs recall it. The wind over the Yucatas still speaks of him. He may have passed into history, but his dream remains. And in that dream of unity, of dignity, of endurance, a nation lives on. No trumpets marked its fall. No final battle carved its name into stone. The Purépecha Empire did not end with fire, but with silence, a slow dimming of light, a turning of the world's gaze elsewhere. And yet, that silence held more than defeat. It held dignity. In the histories of conquest, much is written of those who resisted with war and died upon their fields. But the Purépecha chose another path, one harder to honor, yet no less noble. They chose to endure. They had stood against the greatest power of the Nawa world and held their ground. They had faced the strange winds from the sea and met them with patience. And even when betrayal stole their king, they did not disappear. They adapted. They continued. The empire faded, yes. The temples were left to the sun and rain. The crown passed not to a successor, but to silence. The laws were rewritten in another tongue. Yet in the streets of Uruapan, in the hills around Pátzcuaro, in the hands of those who shaped copper and clay, the empire never truly died. It became quieter. It withdrew from maps and chronicles. But in the language spoken softly at night, in the gestures of hospitality, in the gaze of a grandmother watching her grandson thread the loom, it lived. The weight of memory was not carried in books, but in being. The people knew who they were, even if no one asked. They remembered. And that memory was not loud. It was enduring, like the roots of an old tree that remain long after the trunk has fallen. To outsiders, it might have seemed that the Purépecha had been conquered. But to those who still walked the ancient paths, who still spoke to the wind with reverence and placed offerings for the dead, it was clear. The empire had only become invisible. Its stones still stood. Its stories still passed. Its soul, though quiet, remained whole. And in that silence, that resilient, unwavering silence, there was a kind of power that conquest could not reach. Even as the great empire dissolved, its outline remained etched across the land, not in borders, but in names. These names, like ancient embers, continued to glow softly across the hills and waters of Mykokan, marking the places where a civilization once lived in balance with stone, sky, and sacred fire. There was Tsintsantsan, the hummingbird place, still poised beside the lake like a sentinel of memory. The Yakata pyramid stood in solemn silence, their rounded stones defiant against wind and time. No longer filled with incense and chant, they became places of quiet pilgrimage, not just for faith, but for remembrance. To the north and east lay Pátzcuaro, the gateway to the lake's heart. Its name, the place of foundations, had long held sacred weight. Even beneath Spanish facades and churches, the old paths lingered. Janitzio, the island of the dead, still rose from the waters, now crowned with a new monument, but its soul unchanged. Beneath the stone statue stood the resting place of the ancestors, whose spirits moved with the morning mist. In the forests and foothills stood Uruapan, where water flowed in 1,000 threads and fruit trees bent under ancient rhythms. Its name meant the flowering, and indeed, the culture that had once bloomed in empire continued to blossom there in other forms, in markets, in crafts, in language. Other names remained as well: Erongaraquaro, Zirahuan, Quitsio, Tacambaro. Each spoke not only of geography, but of identity. These were not just coordinates, they were anchors in a sea of change. They held the syllables of a time when lakes were sacred and rulers drew legitimacy from gods and lineage, not distant crowns. To the outsider, these names might seem decorative echoes of the past. But to the Purépecha, they were part of a living map, one not drawn on parchment, but carried in the soul. Each name was a marker of presence, of survival, of a bond between people and place. They were reminders that this land had not always belonged to viceroys or governors. It had once pulsed with its own order, its own beauty, language, and law. And though the empire had receded, these names endured. They were spoken in greetings, traced in song, carved into wood and clay. In them lived the memory of a people who had never truly left, only changed, only quieted, only waiting. For as long as the names remained, so too did the story. They once lit their sacred flame atop the Yakatas of Tsintsantsan, tending it day and night, for it was not merely a symbol, it was identity. That fire, once visible for leagues across the lake, had gone out with the fall of the empire. But the people who had kindled it, the Purépecha, the people of the fire, had not vanished. Their resistance took no banners. It bore no armies. It was not marked by revolts or proclamations. It was quiet, deliberate, and enduring. It lived in the continued use of their language, in the rhythmic motions of daily craft, in the hushed stories whispered to children beneath the stars. Even under the heavy hand of colonial governance, the Purépecha did not forget who they were. They adapted, yes, but adaptation was not surrender. Spanish governors ruled the land, but in the kitchens, fields, and workshops, it was still Purépecha customs that shaped the day. This was resistance by memory, the refusal to let go of one's name, one's rhythm, one's soul. And in time, it became something more. Through centuries of suppression, the Purépecha continued to speak their truth, not always with voice, but with presence. They reclaimed it in their markets, where goods were exchanged with words that had survived empires. They reclaimed it in their rituals, where Catholic saints stood beside older spirits, not as replacements, but as companions. They reclaimed it in their land, passed down through generations, tended with reverence and knowledge that no foreign decree could erase. By the 20th century, their quiet survival began to gain voice again. Scholars listened. Activists rose. Artists and elders spoke with renewed strength, reminding the world that this was not a people of the past, but of continuity. They were no longer hidden. They had endured the flames of empire, the chill of silence, and the weight of forgetfulness. And now, the people of the fire were rekindling their flame, in schools, in councils, in the public square. Their story was not a tale of disappearance, but of transformation. They had lost a kingdom, but they had preserved their essence. And now, they carried it forward, not as relics, but as heirs to a living legacy. For true resistance is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet, steady act of being again and again, in spite of everything. There are stories that fade with time, and there are those that smolder, waiting for breath. The story of the Purépecha was never lost, only quiet. And now, after centuries of silence and endurance, the embers have begun to glow once more. In the highlands and valleys of Mykokan, in towns where copper still sings and language still flows like a stream through generations, the revival has begun. Children now learn not only the history taught in schools, but the stories of their own grandparents, of Tarascan and the lakes, of the sacred fire, of the days when their people stood alone against empires. In some places, the Purépecha language is no longer spoken only by the old, it is heard again in classrooms, songs, and radio. Words once confined to memory are alive again on the lips of the young. Artisans continue to shape copper, wood, and clay, not just for commerce but as declaration. Every carved image, every painted motif carries within it the pride of identity, the quiet but unmistakable voice of a people who have reclaimed their name. Festivals echo with music older than the conquerors. Dancers move in rhythms traced from the past, dressed in patterns that recall the ancient fire. Offerings are laid not just to saints, but to ancestors. What once was hidden has become heritage. But this is not a return to what was. The Purépecha have not turned back. They have moved forward, carrying the best of their past into a new century, walking between two worlds and forging their own path. In councils and communities, they speak for themselves about land, about justice, about language and rights. They are no longer content to be remembered only in museum glass or footnotes. They are a living people, still shaping their world. And as the morning mist rises over Lake Pátzcuaro, as the sun touches the Yakartas once more, it is not mourning that fills the air, but quiet pride. The flame that once crowned Tzintzuntzan has returned, not on a pyre, but in spirit. It is in the people. The Purépecha were never truly conquered. Their empire may have ended, but their story never did. Now, it rises again, from embers to dawn. The story does not end, not truly. History, like the lake, has no final shore. It moves, it reflects, it remembers. And in the stillness of the waters that surround Tzintzuntzan, the heart of the Purépecha world, the memory of a civilization breathes on. They were a people of fire and copper, of measured words and unshaken resolve. They built not for spectacle, but for endurance, temples that curved with the land, cities aligned to lake and sun, a kingdom held not by terror, but by order and belief. They resisted, not only on the battlefield, but in the soul. Against the pressure of conquest, they responded not with oblivion, but with transformation. They bowed to no empire, yet when the winds changed, they bent without breaking. Their king died in betrayal, their throne extinguished in silence, but their people endured. In language, in craft, in memory, the Purépecha passed through darkness without losing their name. And what is civilization, if not memory made durable? The lakes still whisper their story. The hills still cradle their towns. The old gods may no longer be named aloud, but their echoes live in songs and footsteps, in the curve of a pot, in the smoke of an offering on All Saints' Day. There are no more Kazonsai, no great stone courts filled with tribute. But there is still dignity, and that is the truest legacy of a great people. Dignity in survival. Dignity in remembrance. Dignity in the quiet refusal to forget who they are. Let it be known, the Purépecha were never lesser. They were not footnotes in the shadow of Tenochtitlan. They were the ones the Aztecs could not conquer. They were the guardians of the western lakes. They were the bearers of copper, of law, of balance. And they are still here. The chronicles of the lakes are not only written in books. They are spoken beside fires. They are danced beneath the moon. They are painted in color, whispered in lullabies, woven into every thread of a people who remember. What endures is not empire. What endures is identity. And that is where the story rests, not in endings, but in remembrance. In the land of lakes, the fire has not gone out. It lives still, in hearts, in hands, in names. It must be remembered.